Good afternoon. My name is Viviana, and I head the program on issues related to health, technology, intellectual property, and biodiversity at the South Center. So it's with great pleasure that I accepted the kind invitation of Matthew Rimmer and Mohammed Sahir Abbas to participate remotely. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here virtually. So I will be discussing or sharing some thoughts with regards to the recently agreed Global Digital Compact of the United Nations. So first of all, the Global Digital Compact is part of the Pact of the Future. So the Pact of the Future is the outcome of a process that took more than 2 years. And it mainly was looking at how can the United Nations find common ground in terms of the vision for what needs to be taken forward to advance common multilateral solutions on critical global problems. So a key element behind that thinking is that the role of the United Nations needs to be central in upholding multilateralism, in keeping peace among nations, as is one of the founding objectives of the United Nations, and to increase cooperation to build solutions to global problems. Now, these activities that the United Nations should play a leadership on is increasingly being tested, of course, with the multitude of challenges and the rising crises affecting countries around the world. So from climate change, poverty and hunger, rising inequality, high levels of debt, rising health emergencies and the recent pandemic of COVID-19, increasing pollution and biodiversity loss, of course, wars and genocide, and the rising political tensions overall, that we've arrived to a place where the international community, and in the words of the UN Secretary General, he stated in 2023 that it would seem that the international community is incapable of coming together to respond. So the Pact of the Future has been considered to be an opportunity, or a last opportunity, as was mentioned, for the international community to, on the one hand, really move towards increasing cooperation to address global issues that are really challenges, not for certain countries, but really that it's a challenge for humanity, and that we're really at a crossroads where we need to do things differently. And secondly, that the Sustainable Development Agenda goals that were established as part of the common vision under the Agenda for 2030 for Sustainable Development, that there has been insufficient progress and a reversal of progress even on some of the Sustainable Development Agenda goals, so that the Pact of the Future should also help to push forward more accelerated implementation of the SDGs. And of course, the United Nations in its own role and its own relevance will seeking then to be at the center of the solutions and bringing together for a multilateral coordinated response. So I will focus on the Global Digital Compact, which is an annex to the Pact of the Future. And the Pact of the Future, of course, was coming out of the Summit of the Future that was held in September this year. So the Global Digital Compact, which had its own parallel process of negotiation, and this is between all the member states of the United Nations, it was integrated as part of that outcome of the part of the future as an annex. Now, an important point to note, of course, is that overall the Pact of the Future and the Global Digital Compact, it is a non-binding document, but it still has its value in the sense that just as we had for the 2030 agenda so far, it still establishes what is, on the one hand, a common vision, but also what are some of the commitments that overall countries are engaging on. So while it's aspirational, it still sets the ideals and, in a way, the best practices. And then the commitments or that stem out of these non-binding documents still are quite significant then in becoming elements that become implemented even by the United Nations and its own agencies in the work. So these ideas and the specific commitments will be followed up by different agencies and countries, and of course, different stakeholders that see value in that. So while many might say, as it's non-binding, what will this serve in practice, in particular with the difficulties we have now in multilateral cooperation? Really, I think we have to see this as, well, we might not be able to see that this is something that will bind directly, not just governments, but the stakeholders that need to give solutions on these areas. But it does set that framework under which then you can push for further commitments. So one of the other important just general elements is that while this was negotiated by governments, it's open for endorsement by industry and by other stakeholders. And that's important to note because while the commitments that are established are mainly the governments themselves that agreed, a lot of what needs to get done, of course, involves other stakeholders, and industry being a key one in issues that we're talking about, digital technologies. As well as digital cooperation overall, where we don't have some governance frameworks at all in some issues, including on emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. Therefore, the dynamics in terms of implementation or attention also to what is in the Global Digital Compact will be important to see in other fora as well, as the United Nations has not been, at least not the New York Central United Nations General Assembly purview, has not been the central place where this usual discussions were happening. A lot of it happens either in separate technical agencies, or we've had other UN bodies that have been more involved in some of the specific conversations, for example, with the International Telecommunications Union, with the start of the World Summit for Information Society process, and of course a lot of different kind of stakeholders directly very much involved vis-a-vis this process, which was more centered in government negotiation, while there was consultations with many other stakeholders. But it does give another different air to why these issues were being brought up at that level of United Nations between governments, in a way of saying, well, we're taking, back some of this responsibility for digital governance by coming up with this Global Digital Compact, vis-a-vis, for example, waiting for the World Summit of Information Society +20 process that is due to start next year, 2025. And you would say, well, we have now a Global Digital Compact right before that. How then is that going to coordinate as well with the WSIS +20 follow-up process? And so for many stakeholders, this has been a question about, are governments now taking increasing roles on some of these aspects, which has been, of course, a longstanding issue on digital governance. But we are likely to see more and more that the United Nations, already through the UN Office of the Technology Envoy, but through now implementation of some of the commitments here in the Global Digital Compact, that there will be that increasing role to try to do more, let's say, centralized coordination or deliberations through this direct UN New York process. So what does the Global Digital Compact contain? First of all, it has a broad range of issues that's covering, though it focused on 5 general objectives. This is quite a long document. So I'll try to summarize and give some elements of our analysis just based on key priority areas. And just to note, South Center has done some previous policy papers looking at this process and has given comments. We were very much involved also in the process of commenting on different drafts. So we'd also invite you to look at on our website for additional resources on reflections on this issue. The Global Digital Compact, it starts with recognizing the need to address from a multilateral perspective some of these real dangers in terms of what's happening with digital technologies and, for example, misinformation, issues of lack of trust, of the concentration that there is both by particular private parties and by, a subset of governments who have more of a decision-making power, control even on institutions where key decisions are taken. Even in the case, for example, of very technical issues of the day-to-day running of the internet. And of course, dangers with regards to new emerging technologies like AI that we don't know exactly its power and how it might be used, and where there's very little regulation so far. And those that are regulating tend to be, few countries that are taking the lead. So an absence of voices, for example, of the broad range of developing countries. And of course, increasing inequities that have always been present in terms of digital realm. But increasingly, we haven't seen a significant decrease in terms of the gap in digital divides, but actually these have been widening. So that increasing recognition of the need to really address the digital divide that we talk about so much, but we don't see enough progress, and in particularly with regards to new technologies now that are increasing those gaps. So one of the core objectives is, or as it was specified more broadly, was to establish, this vision for an inclusive, open, sustainable, fair, secure digital future for all. So quite ambitious in the broad objective. And the compact includes some general negotiated reflections on some priority issues and then some specific commitments. And the commitments have been tied to the year 2030, so linked to the implementation of the SDGs. And of course, there will be a divergence in the kind of commitments that are made. Some are by the governments themselves, and some are commitments that are being suggested for other parties, in particular, technology companies or social media platforms or developers to take as part of solutions to the issues addressed. And one of the points that it's also important to note is that these are actions or commitments that do not extend to any military domain. So that just, for example, on the issue of regulation of artificial intelligence use in warfare, that is something that was outside of the scope of the Global Digital Compact. And of course, it is a gap in terms of governments of something that needs to be addressed in the future in a more inclusive way. So one of the first objectives is with regards to the digital divide. So recognizing the large gap that continues to be there, and that the sustainable development goals related to closing the digital divide have not been yet achieved. So there's over 2.6 billion people still lacking access to internet. And it highlights the need for connectivity also for schools, so directly related to education and to hospitals. To have better basic health services. The issue of accessibility and affordability of digital technologies is highlighted, as well as the issue of inclusiveness with regards to having more diverse languages and formats. There are no very detailed commitments other than trying to make headway towards the 2030 broad commitments in this area. What is new is we see a commitment to increase investments in digital public goods. So that conceptualization of the digital public goods and of digital public infrastructure. So while there's diverse models for digital public infrastructure, for example, it has been very important in the example being in a large country such as India, where digital public infrastructure has helped with inclusive digital transformation, and in particular also making sure that basic public services can be made available to all populations, regardless, whether they're in rural or in urban environments. And this really is part of them being able to have a range of rights recognized and services provided to them. So there is a recognition or a commitment to increase investment to develop digital public infrastructure while recognizing that divergence in models. And it highlights related to that that well, it does not only support open source software or open sharing models as the underlying basis of digital public infrastructure, which could have been positive. It still generally refers to the value of open standards and open source software, for example, which are aligned to that digital public good perspective. So that all needs to be built in. So a lot of space for then focusing on this approach of how can a more open environment for digital public goods construction and for digital public infrastructure be done. And ensuring, of course, that there's also appropriate safeguards so that the public can trust these services and the use of those digital services, and that they feel, that their rights, including for privacy, are also secured. Another important part of the inclusion element on this first objective is to scale up the international cooperation and financing for developing capacities in the digital realm for developing countries. So that is included as a commitment, though we don't see any monetary actual values as targets or particular elements for the international cooperation in this area. So recognition of digital education, in particular for developing countries and financing, is there, but we don't have more concrete commitments or mechanisms for ensuring that that will be scaled up. And as you know, some of the EU agencies that provide some assistance in this area, such as UNESCO, are still quite under resourced to be able to provide the kind of expansion that's necessary. In terms of a related objective, the second objective is very much related, which is on expanding inclusion and benefits for the digital economy. So about dealing with existing inequalities, as well as ensuring that the digital market is not so concentrated. And there is a part of the earlier discussion in the Global Digital Compact that recognizes that there exist these concentrations of both capacities and technology, but also concentration of market power, and that there's a need for smaller players, including small and medium enterprises, to be able to access and compete in the digital economy. While that problem is identified, there's no particular solutions that are provided in terms of how to deal with that market concentration. And what could be the way forward in terms of increased regulation and, for example, more mandates for transparency and potentially even use of competition law. So a big gap in terms of really addressing those issues about concentration, both in market players and in terms of capacities. A third objective is with regards to the safety overall of the digital space and the concept of open digital space, which it leaves an interpretation as not open in the sense of openness of open software or openness of the access to the underlying technology or algorithms or transparency on the data that's used even for training models, but it refers more about sort of promoting a more open sharing of data and of participation in the digital environment, while at the same time, then it links to the promotion of human rights. So it is quite central in the Global Digital Compact that the human rights are strongly mentioned, including upholding international humanitarian law, human rights law. And it, for example, has commitments on establishing safeguards to prevent any adverse impact of human rights that can arise from the use of digital and emerging technologies or for violations and abuses of human rights in the digital space. And it establishes, for example, the suggestions to have due diligence, more effective oversight and remedy mechanisms. And interestingly, in this section, there are direct calls on the private sector, for example, on digital technology companies, on social media platforms, and on developers, with regard to upholding human rights, including with particular suggestions, for example, to do due diligence and impact assessments of the technologies, also to ensure the respect of human rights online, being accountable for measures in terms of preventing abuses and for mitigating these abuses. Different examples of what could be measures to be taken in this area. And as well, there is a direct mention to providing access to effective remedy as in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Linking back to those responsibilities of the private sector in terms of promotion and protection of human rights. Another important element that becomes part of the section is, the push and pull between the roles of government via the other stakeholders, whether the private sector or the technical community that likes to be seen as separate from civil society, academia, and other kind of stakeholders in order to take different roles in the digital space, but then the tension with regards to what digital cooperation means and how much governments should be involving multi-stakeholder in the related both regulation and solutions. So this is embodied as part of this section of the objective by stating that multi-stakeholderism is key to advance that goal of inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital future. At the same time, many other elements of the Global Digital Compact will focus on the important role that government has in regulation, and also that through the UN, they might have in particular in some of the specific areas where government regulation in particular is very important. But here we have, the general sort of multi-stakeholderism mentioned, including the support for the Internet Governance Forum, which has always been an issue of tension in a way of governments that do participate there, but they don't see that in particular for issues of public policies that they have, any particular specific lead through this process. So the Internet Governance Forum was not the place for governments that want to have more a direct role in terms of that public policy coordination with regards to digital governance. And at the same time, other stakeholders pushing back that rather keep all these issues in these kind of open forum, such as the Internet Governance Forum. So here it is noted, this was something that was quite debated, but the support for the forum is included, as well as recognition of the other outstanding follow-up processes. Now coming to a fourth objective, and this is the fourth of the 5 core objectives that are stated. The core issue here on the objective is really about strengthening data governance cooperation. And also it highlights a lot the issue of advancing interoperability, in particular between digital systems, so how they're operating nationally and how they can be interoperable with others. So that is it's an area that's still, a contentious issue because it's about sovereignty of countries over their own data governance frameworks. But the Global Digital Compact overall is highlighting sort of the vision, a commitment towards more interoperability, as well as, enabling data flow that would be both in line with a human rights approach. So, for example, having sufficient trust from users and with regards to also respect of their rights and including privacy, but as well as allowing more data flow between countries themselves, while recognizing there are different safeguards to that. So on the issue of data flows, which is a very sensitive issue, there is general support for finding common ground towards facilitating data flows, but it does not go into any particular kind of commitments. Rather, it establishes that there will be an effort to identify mechanisms to enable data to flow within and between countries to mutual benefit. So what the compact does not address, for example, is the tensions with regards to what is seen between countries as, is there a just framework in terms of recognizing the value of data and who are the players that are able to access data and then use that data and not necessarily, the system is not necessarily operating in a way that is fair for all countries where there might be, a lot of sharing of data, both of their users and, of their many data that can be quite valuable products, and instead they're also not getting any particular benefits. So there is sensitivities within the approach of facilitated cross-border data flows, and this will continuously be an area where it will be difficult to find common ground, in particular for developing countries that have seen that they're not necessarily benefiting from giving a very facilitated access to data of their populations. So just on a similar note with regards to advancing issues with regards to interoperability, there is also the issue of trying to increase more consultation with different stakeholders, as well as centralize or a call for the United Nations system to play a key role on ensuring that there could be more capacity building towards building an understanding on interoperable data governance. So it does not point to the solution, but it points to sort of mechanisms that could be developed, and in particular within the United Nations, to build capacities to then define what would be an adequate interoperable data governance system and how would data flows be addressed. So quite broad and flexible there in terms of it shows that the negotiation on these points where could not go beyond, these general elements that, of course, even in the area of trade are quite sensitive. Now, in terms of particular commitments that are more concrete, for example, in this area, there is a request for the Commission of Science and Technology for Development to establish a working group that would have a multi-stakeholder dialogue on data governance. So that would, be a process for discussion on the CSTD, which is hosted usually under UNCTAD. And this working group will report to the General Assembly on the progress and with recommendations of what might be equitable and interoperable data governance arrangements. So that will be a process to be followed. And it focuses on, again, this element of interoperability between data systems, between countries or regions or at the international level. And here, for example, for interoperability, a key question is usually, okay, if we're looking for, what are standards that then lead towards more interoperability? Well, what are the dynamics for setting standards, and whose standards are going to be the ones that are going to be adopted? And that, of course, is not neutral in terms of, what's the underlying power balance for who is able to be the leading standard, and what countries will be trying to have those standards be prioritized versus others. And of course, in our current framework of more geopolitical tension, this issue about agreeing to common standards and issues with regards to data flows becomes even more complex. Then just to come to the last element, which is a very new part of what the Global Digital Compact contributes to, is the issue of the international governance of artificial intelligence. And so this is the first United Nations, sort of attempt to give a roadmap towards how should artificial intelligence be regulated, from a more multilateral approach, as this has been happening, domestically by a few countries leading on this discussion. So one of the key issues is, it's a process that, in particular for developing countries, was really important to say we want to be on the table where discussions are being made about, where is artificial governance going, artificial intelligence, the technologies going, and how, what are the impacts, and we want to be with an equal voice on these discussions. Of course, the issue of concentration of capacities on AI and infrastructure is at the base of this as well. So another important element of what's been decided here is how can developing countries be supported to build more capacities with regards to, the positive potential of the use of new emerging technologies, in particular artificial intelligence. So there's a particular decision or a commitment that is to establish an international scientific panel on artificial intelligence, and also a global policy dialogue on artificial intelligence. So this follows a few of the resolutions on artificial intelligence that have also been taking place recently or this year at the United Nations. And we've had one from China, which focuses on building, a cooperative framework and cooperation for developing countries in the area of AI. And there was a general early resolution that was first led by the United States on, some common principles or approaches towards regulation of artificial intelligence. And then finally, one important element was that there's no specific, let's say, financial commitment beyond considering options for how to provide more financing for developing countries to be able to benefit from artificial intelligence and to develop this technology for their own use. So there is language of considering options for a global fund that would take on this role. But that, of course, will require, follow-up to see whether and where will this discussion for a potential global fund on AI, which is really on capacity building towards developing countries, where would that be placed? But there is a substantial interest on this. So we do see that the Global Digital Compact on the area of AI, brings this new elements, and in particular that the UN at this level then will be trying to set a forum for where should there be a multilateral discussion and how should AI governance go. So that is a significant, important element for developing countries in terms of being at that table for that conversation. So I think I'm exhausting my time. I'll stop there, my intervention. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation, and feel free to get in touch for any subsequent questions or discussion. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of this conference.